She walked into the restaurant wearing her best dress, ready to celebrate 10 years of marriage. But instead of champagne and roses, she found her husband's tongue down another woman's throat. What she did in the next 60 seconds didn't just end her marriage, it destroyed his entire world. Diane Harper had always been the kind of woman who commanded respect the moment she entered a room. At 38, she was a senior corporate attorney at one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms, the kind of woman who could dismantle a hostile witness with a smile and negotiate multi-million-dollar deals before lunch. Her natural hair was always perfectly styled, her suits tailored to perfection, and her mind sharper than any knife in the courtroom. She'd worked twice as hard as everyone else her entire life because she knew that's what it took, and she'd done it all while building a marriage she thought was unbreakable. Brandon Mitchell had swept her off her feet 12 years ago at a charity gala. He was handsome, charming, and came from the kind of old money that opened doors in Atlanta's social circles. He was a real estate developer with big dreams and even bigger ambitions. When they married, people whispered, some in admiration, others in barely concealed judgment, a successful black woman and a man from one of the city's prominent families. They seemed perfect on paper, and for a while they were perfect in reality too. But perfection requires maintenance, and Diane had been doing all the work. Over the years, she'd put her own dreams on hold. She'd wanted to start her own practice to fight for the underdog instead of protecting corporate interests. But Brandon's business kept expanding, and he needed her expertise. She drafted his contracts, negotiated his deals, pulled him out of a potentially devastating lawsuit that would have bankrupted him. She was his secret weapon, his behind-the-scenes genius, and she told herself it was temporary, that once his company was stable, she'd finally chase her own dreams. Their 10th anniversary arrived on a crisp October evening. Diane had spent the entire day preparing. Her stylist had worked magic on her hair, she'd bought a stunning emerald dress that hugged her curves perfectly, and she'd rehearsed the words she wanted to say 100 times. She had two surprises for Brandon. First, she was finally ready to leave the firm and start her own practice, and second, the one that made her hands shake with excitement, she was 8 weeks pregnant. They'd been trying for years, and she'd almost given up hope. Brandon had been distant lately, claiming a major development deal was consuming all his time, but he'd promised to meet her at Rousseau's at 8 o'clock sharp. It was their place, the French restaurant where he'd proposed, where they celebrated every milestone. Diane arrived 15 minutes early, too excited to wait at home. She wanted to see his face when she told him about the baby. The valet took her car and she walked toward the entrance, her heels clicking against the cobblestone. That's when she saw them through the large glass window, her husband in their corner booth, the one they always requested. But he wasn't alone. He was leaning across the table, his hand cradling the face of a young white woman with flowing blonde hair and a dress that probably cost more than most people's rent. And he was kissing her. Not a peck, not an accident. A real kiss, the kind that spoke of intimacy and comfort and time spent together. Diane's world tilted. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. 10 years. 10 years of sacrifice, of building him up, of putting herself second. And here he was, on their anniversary, with someone else. The rational part of her brain, the attorney part, kicked in. She could walk away. She could pretend she never saw this. She could... No, that wasn't who she was. Diane Harper didn't run from anything. She pushed through the door with such calm that the hostess smiled at her. She walked through the restaurant as every eye turned to watch her. She was stunning, and she knew it. When she reached their booth, Brandon looked up. The color drained from his face so fast she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Diane," he choked out, pulling away from the woman. This isn't—" "Happy anniversary, baby," Diane said, her voice steady as steel. She looked at the woman who had the audacity to smile. Up close, she recognized her. Christine Vanderbilt, 26 years old, daughter of the Vanderbilt real estate empire, a woman whose entire life had been handed to her on a silver platter. She'd met her once at a charity function. Christine had looked right through her, the way wealthy white women often did. "Oh, honey," Christine said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Did he not tell you? Brandon and I have been together for over a year. We're actually engaged." She held up her left hand where a diamond the size of a small planet caught the light. "I'm so sorry you had to find out this way." The restaurant had gone quiet. Diane could feel every eye on them, could hear the whispers starting, could see phones being lifted to record. Brandon was stammering, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. But he wasn't denying it. He wasn't defending her. He was just sitting there, caught, looking between his wife and his mistress like a child caught stealing cookies. "Brandon and I are perfect together," Christine continued, emboldened by his silence. "We come from the same world, the same circles. Surely you understand. You were useful for a while, I'll give you that. Smart, capable. But let's be honest. Did you really think a man like Brandon would stay with someone like you forever? He was always going to end up with someone from his actual world." The words landed like physical blows. "Someone like you." Diane heard them, understood their meaning, felt the old familiar sting of racism dressed up in polite society language. And still, Brandon said nothing. That hurt more than anything. After everything she'd done for him, he couldn't even find the courage to defend her. A man in a suit approached their table. Diane recognized him as the restaurant manager. "Ma'am," he said quietly, looking at Diane with uncomfortable pity, "perhaps it would be best if you left. We don't want to cause a scene." There it was. Even in her own humiliation, she was the problem. Not the cheating husband, not the smug mistress. Her. Diane looked at Brandon one last time. His eyes were pleading with her to just go, to not make this worse for him. And in that moment, something inside her crystallized. This wasn't the man she'd married, or maybe it was, and she just refused to see it. "You're right," Diane said quietly. "I should go." She turned and walked out with her head high, ignoring the murmurs and the camera phones. She held herself together until she reached her car. Then she drove, barely seeing the road through her tears, until she found herself in front of her late grandmother's house. The neighborhood had changed over the years, gotten rougher. The house had been abandoned for 2 years since her grandmother passed. Diane sat in her car in the driveway and finally let herself fall apart. Great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the marriage she'd lost, for the man she thought she knew, for the 10 years she'd given to someone who saw her as temporary. Her phone buzzed constantly, text messages, calls, social media notifications. Someone had already posted video of the restaurant confrontation. It was going viral. Her humiliation was entertainment for thousands of strangers. Then the calls started from her law firm, the senior partners suggesting she take immediate personal leave. They didn't say it directly, but she understood. Her personal scandal was bad for business. The firm represented several of Brandon's associates. This was messy. She was being pushed out. Diane sat in that car until dawn, crying until she had no tears left. Then, as the sun rose, something shifted. She wiped her face, took a deep breath, and opened her laptop. If she was going down, she was going to understand why. She started reviewing files, every contract she'd ever drafted for Brandon, every deal she'd negotiated. She knew his business inside and out. She'd built most of it. That's when she saw it. A transfer that didn't make sense. She dug deeper, then deeper still. By noon, she'd traced a web of shell companies, forged signatures, and irregular transactions. Brandon wasn't just a successful real estate developer, he was a fraud. He'd been embezzling from his investors for at least 5 years, laundering money through fake companies, cooking the books on property values. The total amount was staggering, over $40 million. And the Vanderbilt family, Christine's family, were his largest investors. Diane's hands shook as she realized something else. He'd been using her work to cover his tracks. Contracts she'd drafted, documents that bore her electronic signature. He'd been forging her name, making her an unwitting accomplice. If this came out, she wouldn't just lose her career, she could face criminal charges, She spent the next 3 days in that abandoned house, barely sleeping, building an airtight case. She documented everything, made copies of copies, backed up files in 3 different locations. She was thorough because that's who she was, and as she worked, a plan began to form. Brandon had betrayed her. He'd humiliated her. He'd stolen her work and her trust and 10 years of her life. But he'd also made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated her. On the 4th day, Brandon's attorney called. He was filing for divorce. He was offering her a settlement of $50,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. $50,000. For 10 years of marriage and a business empire she'd helped build that was worth over $200 million. It was an insult designed to break her further. Diane almost laughed. Instead, she agreed to meet. They met at Brandon's attorney's office in a sleek downtown high-rise. Brandon arrived with Christine on his arm, both of them dressed like they were attending a society luncheon. Christine's engagement ring caught every light. They looked so confident, so certain that Diane would just sign and disappear. The attorney, a balding man named Harold, who'd always treated Diane with barely concealed condescension, slid the papers across the mahogany table. "It's a generous offer, all things considered," Harold said. "Mr. Mitchell is being very fair." Diane picked up the papers, pretended to read them. She could feel Christine's smug smile, could hear Brandon's relieved exhale. They thought she was beaten. She set the papers down without signing. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. She slid it across the table. "What's this?" Brandon asked, but his voice had gone tight with fear. "Open it," Diane said calmly. Brandon opened the folder. She watched the color drain from his face. Inside was everything. Bank records, forged documents, shell company transactions, investor statements, email evidence, a complete map of his fraud. Christine leaned over to look, her brow furrowing in confusion. "That's every illegal transaction you've made in the past 5 years," Diane said conversationally. "Embezzlement, fraud, money laundering, forgery, including forging my signature on documents to cover your tracks. The total amount stolen from your investors is approximately $42 million. The Vanderbilt family alone is out about $18 million. The room had gone completely silent. Brandon's mouth opened and closed. Harold grabbed the folder, flipping through pages with growing horror. "I've already sent copies to the FBI, the SEC, and the Georgia Bar Association," Diane continued. "They opened investigations this morning. I expect you'll be arrested within the week." "You can't do this," Brandon whispered. "Diane, please, we can work this out." "Oh, but I'm not done," Diane said, and now she let herself smile. "You see, I was contacted 3 months ago by an attorney representing an anonymous client. They wanted me to investigate potential fraud in your company. They offered me a significant fee for a thorough forensic audit. I almost said no because I was your wife and I thought I knew you, but something made me say yes. Maybe some part of me already suspected." She turned to Christine. "That anonymous client, it was your grandmother, Margaret Vanderbilt." Christine's face went white. "That's not possible. My grandmother would never—" "Your grandmother is 84 years old and not a fool," Diane said. "She built the Vanderbilt fortune from nothing after your grandfather died. She knew something was wrong with Brandon's numbers. And when she found out about your affair, she wanted to know exactly who her granddaughter was planning to marry. She hired me, anonymously, to find out, and I did." The implications settled over the room like a shroud. Brandon hadn't just been stealing from investors. He'd been stealing from the most powerful family in Atlanta. And Christine, who thought she was marrying up, had actually been dating a criminal who was robbing her family blind. "The FBI raid is scheduled for this afternoon," Diane said, standing up. "Your assets will be frozen, your company dissolved. And Christine, your grandmother asked me to tell you that you're cut off. No more trust fund, no more credit cards, no more family connections. She says you can earn your way back into her good graces by testifying against Brandon, or you can go down with him. Your choice." She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Brandon lunged after her, grabbing her arm. Diane, please, I love you. I always loved you. Christine was a mistake. We can fix this. Just tell them you made a mistake with the files. Please. Diane looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. He was crying now. This man who'd kissed another woman on their anniversary. This man who'd stolen from her, lied to her, used her. And she felt nothing but contempt. Let go of me, she said quietly. When he didn't, she raised her voice. Let go of me or I'll add assault to your charges. He released her like she'd burned him. Diane walked out of that office with her head high, past the secretary who stared in shock, past the other attorneys who'd emerged from their offices at the commotion. She walked out into the Atlanta sunshine and breathed deeply for the first time in days. The next 6 months were a whirlwind. Brandon was arrested just as she'd predicted. The FBI raid on his company made national news. Christine's family publicly disowned her, and the engagement ended in a spectacular fight that also made the news. Christine tried to claim she'd known nothing, but evidence suggested otherwise. She'd helped Brandon hide assets, forge documents, lie to investors. She faced charges of her own. But the most beautiful part, the part that Diane would remember forever, was watching their so-called love crumble the moment the money disappeared. Brandon and Christine turned on each other viciously. He claimed she'd seduced him to gain access to investor information. She claimed he'd manipulated her. Their court battles were ugly, public, and deeply satisfying to watch. Diane, meanwhile, had been busy building. Margaret Vanderbilt, impressed by her thoroughness and integrity, became her first client and mentor. At 84, Margaret was sharper than most people half her age. She helped Diane leave her old firm and start her own practice specializing in corporate fraud and white-collar crime. She became the go-to attorney for whistleblowers and fraud victims. Her reputation grew quickly, the brilliant black woman who'd taken down one of Atlanta's golden boys. The settlement from Brandon's seized assets was substantial, $15 million, but more valuable than the money was her freedom. She was finally doing the work she'd always wanted to do, fighting for people who'd been cheated and stolen from. She was making a real difference, and in the middle of all this chaos, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Grace, after her grandmother. Being a single mother was hard, but she'd rather be alone than with someone who saw her as disposable. Almost exactly a year after that terrible anniversary dinner, Diane was working late in her new office when her assistant buzzed her. "Miss Harper, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent." Diane already knew who it was. Brandon appeared in her doorway looking 20 years older than he was. Prison didn't agree with him. He'd been sentenced to 12 years but was out on bail pending appeal. "You look well," he said quietly. "What do you want, Brandon?" He stepped into her office and she noticed his hands were shaking. "I wanted to apologize for everything. You didn't deserve what I did to you." "No, I didn't." "I loved you, Diane. I know you don't believe me, but I did. I do." She studied him for a long moment. There was a time when those words would have meant everything, when she would have done anything to hear him say he loved her and mean it. But that time had passed. "You're right about one thing, Brandon. I do remember. I remember every contract I drafted that saved you, every investor I convinced to trust you, every night I worked while you worked late or pretended to. I remember building your empire while you built your lies." She stood up, walked around her desk to face him directly. "But here's what you never understood. You didn't break me when you chose her. You freed me. Because now I know exactly what I'm worth, and it's so much more than you ever deserved." She picked up a business card from her desk and handed it to him. "This is my attorney's contact information. If you need to discuss anything related to the divorce or the criminal case, contact her. You have 5 minutes to leave my building. After that, I'm calling security." He looked at the card, then at her. He opened his mouth to speak, but she'd already turned away, back to her computer, back to her work. After a moment, she heard his footsteps retreat. She heard the elevator ding. And then he was gone from her life forever. Diane sat back in her chair and looked at the photos on her desk. Grace, 6 months old, grinning toothlessly at the camera. Her grandmother, strong and proud in a frame that said she believed she could, so she did. And a new photo just added, Diane accepting an award for legal excellence from the Georgia Bar Association, the same organization that had investigated her, cleared her, and now celebrated her. She picked up her phone and called the nanny to check on Grace. Everything was fine. Her daughter was healthy, happy, safe. And tomorrow, Diane had a new case, helping a group of retirement home residents who'd been defrauded by their financial advisor. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. These people had worked their entire lives and deserved justice. As she packed up her briefcase for the night, Diane thought about that woman she'd been a year ago, the one who'd walked into a restaurant expecting roses and found betrayal instead. That woman had been devastated, broken, humiliated. But she'd also been freed. Freed from a man who didn't value her. Freed from a marriage built on inequality. Freed to become exactly who she was always meant to be. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing. Sometimes you have to lose everything to gain yourself. Diane Harper didn't just survive betrayal, she turned it into triumph. Today, her firm has recovered over $2 billion for fraud victims. Brandon served 8 years before being released to a halfway house. He works in a warehouse now, his empire long gone. And Christine, she's still trying to get back into her grandmother's will. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's becoming everything they said you couldn't be. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them, but never let them define who you are. Your value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see your worth. Walk away with your dignity. Success is the sweetest revenge.